I'd go ahead and hazard a guess and say it's a pretty well-established fact that a good, nutritious 3 square meals a day is incredibly important for, well, anyone to function. And even more so for a soldier. As Napoleon once said, an army marches on its stomach. And for a class of people who were regularly expected to forego basic amenities and comforts, with unending marches, sleepless nights being more than common, soldiers needed a lot of food. And in an age where many civilians survived on the brink of starvation, we can't expect their military counterparts to suffer a fate that was much better. And for the most part, that was sadly true. And for British soldiers of the Napoleonic Wars, food was almost a constant struggle. In theory, the men were eating enough calories, but in practice they had a pretty brutal diet. Food was often, unsurprisingly, pretty disgraceful, with some beautiful standouts such as pong, which was bread that was so badly baked it had a burnt exterior and a pasty, sticky interior. Or skilly, which was beef broth with oatmeal added to create a thin, gruel-like mixture. And for breakfast, souloup can't be left unmentioned. In the earlier years of the 19th century, when tea was too expensive for the lowly soldier, they would instead use a soup-like mixture of milk, sugar and sassafras, which is a plant native to North America and serves as a mild stimulant. Something that is certainly not a coincidence is the fact souloup was a popular remedy for venereal diseases, or STDs, and also drunkenness. On top of these quite weird and wonderful additions to the average diet of the day, we also cannot go without mentioning some old favourites. Far from being reserved for Jack Tar, hardtack was also a favourite for the army. Now, hardtack was a type of biscuit made from flour and water. Baked multiple times, it was literally hard as a rock, and in proper conditions could keep for months or even years. But when damp was introduced, as it often was, the hardtack could produce maggots. The old sailor's story of maggots and insects providing extra nutrition seems to not apply for soldiers, however, with accounts marking such appearances as absolutely horrifying, with refusals to eat the tack seemingly a norm. And for the rest of a soldier's meal, they could expect boiled beef or pork, coming in at around £1, or just under half a kilo. A pound of bread, whichever form it came in, a pound of dried peas to make their plates a bit more colourful, an ounce or around 30 grams of butter or cheese, and an ounce of rice. Soldiers would eat 2 meals a day. In the morning, they would have beer and bread, but tea and souloup became more common later on in the period. At midday, the soldiers would eat their first and only officially cooked meal of the day. Beef would be thrown into the cook's pot and boiled. When they were at home, at barracks, messes, which were groups of men who would eat, sleep and drill together, would come up, putting all their rations into a collective, and would do a hidden bid, where the cook would take a piece of meat, hidden from the men, and proclaim, "Who wants this?" This provided the men with a pretty fun game, and ensured some fairness when it came to distribution. No man knew if he was getting gristle or a prime cut. Although how prime of a cut you can get with boiled beef eludes me. Another addition was potatoes. They were also a large part of the soldier's diet, but only when at home in barracks postings. Calorically dense, they were procured by the men themselves, and would be boiled for lunch along with the meat. If a man was still hungry, which he often would be, the so-called hawkers came into play. These were usually ex-soldiers who were the only people allowed into the barracks, and they would become a sort of roving trader for the men. Before the use of barracks, soldiers would instead be billeted. The government would negotiate, or as the more cynical may suggest, force a rate with tavern owners and innkeepers. Soldiers would then be given beds in these establishments, and they were fed by the owners. Think of it like an early form of hotel, although not nearly as luxurious. And up to now, it all sounds pretty good, and you would be right, it was. Soldiers were eating well for the period, around 3,000 calories a day, and they often spent their pay on extra alcohol and extra food. But see, it's pretty easy to feed a group of soldiers when they're living stationary, in country, in organised barracks, located in towns and cities. But feeding soldiers on campaign? Well, that was a different story entirely. On campaign, a soldier ate what he could. Issued rations were often unreliable and supply lines were of critical importance. They were only issued brass cooking pots, one for every 8 cavalrymen and 12 infantrymen. Their main eating utensil in the field was nothing but a small knife to do everything. The expectation was clear: this was not home, and they would not eat like they were at home. But to understand this, we first need to understand how soldiers got their food and how they fought, because the two may be more linked than you think. And we need to go back a little. In 1618, a great war in Europe broke out, the 30 Years' War. It's been deemed by many the first modern war, and for good reason. And while we could sit here for hours talking about combined arms of the Swedish or the Spanish tercios or the Imperial Army, and the many other military revolutions that came from that conflict, what concerns us is the ramifications it had for feeding soldiers. The 30 Years' War saw soldiers hit the battlefield in much bigger numbers, with much greater frequency, and over a more prolonged time than had ever been seen before. Armies and garrisons across Europe spent 30 years clashing. And this posed a pretty large issue. How do you realistically feed hundreds of thousands of men in a world where many armies are still being funded by nobles instead of governments with strong lines of credit, or without trains, planes and automobiles? Well, often you just don't. Soldiers who are not fed become angry and unruly, and an angry soldier is often a violent one. A major issue that arose from the 30 Years' War, and one that still leaves its scar in modern Europe due to the destruction it caused, was the looting and seizure of the countryside. When an army marched through the country, they seized food. If they were unpaid, or even if they were, they burnt and looted too. Armies mutated into something that had fundamentally no purpose. Feeding the army became a task unto itself, requiring marching, foraging, and sometimes fighting to obtain food, which in turn needed more food. Armies became rolling balls of destruction, disconnected from any reality that wasn't concerning their own survival. Ultimately, the 30 Years' War caused famine, disease, and atrocity, resulting in millions of lost lives. Understandably, nobody actually wanted this to ever be repeated. Sure, from a moral standpoint, but also pragmatically. An army that functions like a hungry mob isn't going to fight a good war. And by the latter half of the 18th century, things had evolved. Professional armies would fight in a way that was largely based on supply. They wouldn't live off the land because that would annoy the people that lived off the land. Rather, they would have massive supply trains that kept them going. Armies would thus maneuver around and around and around, trying to cut one another from their supply, forcing them into a disadvantaged, pitched battle. This removed the problem of feeding soldiers, but it created a new one that would be fixed by the French Revolutionary Army when they rolled across their borders. And with liberty came a swarm of men who were fanatic in their loyalty to the Republic's creed. But they were not clothed, fed, trained, or armed to the standards of any of their contemporaries. And so, like turning back the clock, they learned to live off the land. It worked brilliantly for Napoleon in Italy, but perhaps not so well in Russia, where it proved disastrous. For the British, however, this was not their modus operandi. They instead left the feeding of the army to one group, the Commissariat. This was a government organisation who held the sole responsibility of feeding the troops, along with some other token tasks, like supplying some general equipment to the men, that neither the Board of Ordnance nor the regiment itself would cover. But the Commissariat was a notably interesting organisation, albeit mostly for its flaws. The commissariat was notable for more failings than successes, and to understand how soldiers ate, we need to understand the men who fed them. The commissariat was not held under horse guards, which is the equivalent of the Ministry of Defence today. They were a quasi-military institution, being nominally held under military law, but they were controlled directly by His Majesty's Treasury. This was of course quite a peculiar state of affairs that arguably led to its fair share of mishaps. Firstly, commissariat officers were not issued uniforms for most of the Napoleonic Wars. In the end, they were issued a blue uniform, but for the longest time they would serve in whatever they liked. And some of these so-called uniforms they fashioned for themselves could be seen pretty dimly by the men around them, one being described as a hermaphrodite scarlet coat. At a certain point they drew pay both from the army and the treasury, further obscuring their role, especially as they didn't hold military commissions. Further confusing this was the fact that some of them were certainly soldiering men. One died at Talavera leading an ammunition convoy in a desperate attempt to resupply the front. Another won a Victoria Cross at Rorke's Drift, albeit after the commissariat fell under total military control. Others, such as Ruth, who was the leading commissariat officer during Waterloo, was absolutely brilliant at his job. His most notable success, perhaps, is breaking ranks during the famine, distributing food, and organising one of the most efficient relief schemes in history, given the fact he was undermined constantly and brutally underfunded. Even today, he's remembered as a hero of the Irish famine. But of course, not all commissariat officers were so upstanding, because if they were, we wouldn't be here. It was a post absolutely rife with corruption. No qualifications were required until 1810, and even then, only basic English and maths were required. It became a post of who you know, not what you know. The position had unfettered access to government funds, and the men were largely left to their own devices due to their place outside the structure of the army that they fed and followed. One man, Commissary General Jolly, was court-martialled after it was discovered he stole the equivalent of nearly £2 million, or $2.5 million in today's money. This wasn't even over the length of his entire career, but rather a single transaction. One officer appointed by William Pitt, due to being a personal friend of the Prime Minister, which, by the way, is yet another sign of the incompetence of the post, was utterly dismayed when he was sent to create a relief in modern-day Belgium during the French Revolutionary Wars. He wrote, "I am obliged to fight venality and corruption through all ranks, and overcome my feelings every day by turning out men who have large families, and who have been negligent or corrupt in their duty." He would then go on to explain the ease in which bribery came to the people around him, and to his credit, how he turned down one himself in the first days of the job. For the most part, the commissariat was serving to be a bit of a letdown, and often men's stomachs suffered in exchange for lined pockets. But even for the most upstanding, the job of a commissariat officer wasn't actually very easy. In the late 18th century, the British had tried their hand at creating a royal wagon, a standardised, state-controlled baggage train, but it was simply not enough to supply an entire army. On top of this, they were regarded with absolute disdain by almost the entire army, referred to as the Newgate Blues, in reference to both the colour of their uniform and the fact that Newgate held an infamous prison. The insinuation, of course, being that the members of the train were thieves, drawn from prison ranks. One remark that was made about them reads as follows: "Fat General Hamilton with his useless wagon corps." However, despite their muddy reputation, they did have their moments. 2,000 drivers were under British service by 1814, and one Private Brewster was personally praised by Wellington. At Hougoumont, he had driven supplies to the besieged defenders, all while under constant enemy fire. For the most part, however, The actual supplying the army was the primary role of private citizens, mostly locals and natives. They were too regarded as being thieves, cowards, and disorderly, thought to be waiting for the perfect opportunity to cut and run at the sight of danger, taking the supplies to feed an army with them. And so we return back to the poor old soldier who we started with, marching on an empty stomach. British soldiers were totally barred from looting. All their food had to come from legitimate purchases or foraging, or of course army stores. At Badajoz, a drunken, hungry army ransacked the city for days on end, a rare loss of control. Marching through Spain, a diet of acorns and leaves wasn't uncommon. Riflemen were at least allowed to partake in hunting, but this was again disallowed for the average line infantryman. They were completely at the mercy of the commissariat, and if the officer in question so decided to purchase cheap, inadequate supplies for his own monetary benefit, there really wasn't much a soldier could do. It's a common theme of the age that soldiers are at the mercy of everyone around them, for better or for worse. When marching in Portugal in 1810, the army was greeted by Portuguese citizens, giving out free wine and food to the soldiers. For the officers, however, they were forced to pay by the Portuguese. And oftentimes the hunger of the soldiers was almost famine-like. One group of soldiers are noted when being told they would receive no rations for the day, as going into a field and cutting sheaves of wheat. There clearly, however, was not a single baker or miller among them, as they tried to boil the wheat with predictable results. In the morning, many men could not march from sickness. Even when they did have adequate food, sometimes they were bound by the bureaucracy of war. One group of 95th Riflemen were given 3 pounds of hardtack to carry with them, in case of emergencies. A particularly smart move, of course, but only if the soldiers were actually being fed adequately, usually. A strange situation arose in which the men were being forced to carry food for an emergency, but not allowed to eat it despite their hunger. Apparently it seems there was an expectation among command that hunger was normal, and did not constitute an emergency unto itself. And that is part of the story of how Wellington's army ate. How they got their food, and how they didn't. Next video, I think, will probably be an interesting one. The story of prisoners of war. It's going to be a fun one, I hope, and it might throw you a few curveballs. So if that interests you, make sure to stay tuned. And if you enjoyed this video, it would mean a lot to me if you could consider liking and subscribing. And I have some extra links for you in the description. Thank you.